Former CNN anchor Don Lemon was arrested by federal agents on Thursday night in Los Angeles and charged with federal civil rights crimes in connection with a protest at a Minnesota church service on January 18, 2026. Lemon, 59, was taken into custody while covering the Grammy Awards. Attorney General Pam Bondi announced Friday on social media that Lemon and 3 others were arrested at her direction in connection with the coordinated attack on City's Church in St. Paul, Minnesota. The Department of Homeland Security stated Lemon was charged with conspiracy and interfering with the First Amendment rights of worshipers. Also arrested were Traherne Jean Cruz, Georgia Fort, and Jamael Liddell Lundy. Fort is an independent Minnesota journalist and vice president of the Minneapolis chapter of the National Association of Black Journalists. Cruz is the co-founder of Black Lives Matter Minnesota and a former Democratic candidate for the Minnesota House. Lundy is a small business owner and a current Democratic candidate for the Minnesota Senate. The charges stem from the January 18th protest at City's Church in St. Paul. Protesters entered the church during services, chanting, "Ice out," and "Justice for Renee Good." Renee Good was a 37-year-old mother of 3 who was fatally shot by an ICE officer in Minneapolis earlier in January. Another U.S. citizen, Alex Preddy, was also killed by federal agents during immigration enforcement operations in Minnesota. Protesters targeted City's Church because one of its pastors, David Easterwood, serves as the acting field director of the St. Paul YCE field office. Easterwood was recently listed as a defendant in a case brought by protesters who alleged immigration agents had violated their First and Fourth Amendment rights. Lemon was at the protest as an independent journalist. He posted video to his Instagram on January 18th, showing protesters yelling, as well as his interviews with churchgoers and protesters. Lemon stated on the video, "We're not part of the activists, but we're here just reporting on them." He repeatedly told viewers during his coverage, "I'm not here as an activist. I'm here as a journalist." The Washington Post reviewed Lemon's videos from the protest. According to the Post, the footage shows Lemon was with activists before the protest and followed them to the church, where he spent approximately 45 minutes and spoke with 4 parishioners and 5 protesters. In all but one instance, the exchanges appear to be calm. The footage does not show him participating in the chants that disrupted the service. A pastor at one point asks him to leave. 7 minutes later, he exits the church building. Lemon's attorney, Abby Lowell, confirmed his client was taken into custody by federal agents while covering the Grammy Awards. Federal sources told ABC News Lemon was arrested at a Beverly Hills hotel. Don has been a journalist for 30 years, and his constitutionally protected work in Minneapolis was no different than what he has always done. Lowell said in a statement, "The First Amendment exists to protect journalists whose role it is to shine light on the truth and hold those in power accountable." Lowell added, "Instead of investigating the federal agents who killed 2 peaceful Minnesota protesters, the Trump Justice Department is devoting its time, attention, and resources to this arrest, and that is the real indictment of wrongdoing in this case. This unprecedented attack on the First Amendment and transparent attempt to distract attention from the many crises facing this administration will not stand. Don will fight these charges vigorously and thoroughly in court." Los Angeles Mayor Karen Bass spoke out about Lemon on Friday, calling him her friend and saying he was arrested simply for doing his job. Bass said in a statement, Emmy-winning news producer and Minnesota-based journalist Georgia Fort, another widely respected Black journalist, was also arrested by federal agents in Minnesota for reporting on the same protest. The arrest of journalists for going into a church in the course of reporting is shocking enough. But what's even more alarming is that it's no secret that Don Lemon is a Trump critic. Bass stated President Donald Trump is escalating the situation further with their arrests. She said, "Let me be very clear. President Trump is not de-escalating anything after the fatal shootings of U.S. citizens by federal agents. In fact, the arrest of Don Lemon and Georgia Fort demonstrates quite the opposite. He is escalating." The official White House X account posted an image Friday morning touting Lemon's arrest with the caption, "When life gives you lemons," followed by an emoji of chains. Attorney General Bondi said in a video, "You have the right to worship freely and safely. And if I haven't been clear already, if you violate that sacred right, we are coming after you." Bondi spokesperson Gates McGavick posted a meme of the Attorney General with laser beams emanating from her eyes. U.S. Assistant Attorney General Harmeet Dillon posted on X that the church was a space protected from exactly such acts by federal criminal and civil laws. Nor does the First Amendment protect your pseudo-journalism of disrupting a prayer service. The arrest came after a federal magistrate judge last week rejected prosecutors' initial bid to charge Lemon. Lowell stated last week that a magistrate judge rejected charges against Lemon. A source told ABC News that Bondi last week was enraged at the magistrate judge's decision to not charge the journalist. Minnesota Chief U.S. District Judge Patrick Schultz wrote to the Eighth Circuit Appeals Court last week that Lemon and his producer were not protesters at all, and that there is no evidence that those two engaged in any criminal behavior or conspired to do so. The Department of Justice responded to Schultz in a filing unsealed Thursday, stating, "The FACE Act contains no exception that would permit journalists or their producers to use or threaten force or physically obstruct worshipers who are lawfully exercising their First Amendment rights." The FACE Act refers to the Freedom of Access to Clinic Entrances Act, a federal law that makes it a crime to use force, threat of force, or physical obstruction to interfere with someone obtaining or providing reproductive health services or religious services. A grand jury was impaneled Thursday, according to a source familiar with the matter. The FBI and Homeland Security investigations, a law enforcement agency within the Department of Homeland Security, were involved in the arrest. A federal appellate court declined last week to order a lower court judge to sign arrest warrants for 5 people, including Lemon, in connection with the January 18th protest. A prominent civil rights attorney and 2 other people involved in the protest were arrested last week. Prosecutors accused them of civil rights violations for disrupting the service at City's Church. CNN, where Lemon previously worked for 17 years, said in a statement that his arrest raises profoundly concerning questions about press freedom and the First Amendment. The network said it will be following Lemon's case closely. The Department of Justice already failed twice to get an arrest warrant for Don and several other journalists in Minnesota, where a chief judge of the Minnesota Federal District Court found there was no evidence that there was any criminal behavior involved in their work, CNN said in a statement. The First Amendment in the United States protects journalists who bear witness to news and events as they unfold, ensuring they can report freely in the public interest, and the DOJ's attempts to violate those rights is unacceptable. Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer denounced the arrest on the Senate floor, saying it is a dark message to journalists everywhere. If you dare criticize this administration, watch your back. The Committee to Protect Journalists condemned the arrest. The arrest of journalist Don Lemon in connection with his reporting on a protest in Minnesota should alarm all Americans, Catherine Jacobson, who works on the organization's U.S. efforts, said in a statement. Instead of prioritizing accountability in the killings of 2 American citizens, the Trump administration is devoting its resources to arresting journalists. Georgia Fort posted a video on Facebook early Friday announcing, "Agents are at my door," and said her attorney advised her to go with them. According to the National Association of Black Journalists chapter in Minnesota, Fort has won regional awards and served as an officer of the group. Traherne Jean Cruz is a leader of Black Lives Matter Minnesota, who has led many protests and actions for racial justice, particularly following George Floyd's killing in Minneapolis in 2020. After Trump administration officials said earlier this month that arrests would be coming in the church protest, Cruz told the Associated Press there's a tradition of Black activists and leaders being targeted or subjected to violence. Just as being a Black person, you always have to have that in mind, Cruz said. City's Church belongs to the Southern Baptist Convention. The church lists David Easterwood as one of its pastors. Lemon is due before a magistrate judge in California. The other 3 defendants were due for appearances in Minnesota. Lemon left CNN in 2023 after 17 years at the cable network, amid criticism that he made sexist comments about women and aging. Since leaving CNN, Lemon has operated independently, posting regularly on YouTube and appearing on Substack and other social media platforms. During his online show from the church on January 18th, Lemon predicted the administration would try again to charge him after the magistrate judge rejected the initial bid. "And guess what?" he said. "Here I am. Keep trying. That's not going to stop me from being a journalist." The case has drawn sharp criticism from advocates and supporters of Lemon, who argue that his reporting was protected by the First Amendment. Several press freedom and advocacy groups condemned the arrests on Friday. The arrest represents a major development in a case that has stirred national debate over press freedom, federal power, and the boundaries of journalistic activity during protests. The tension between the Trump administration and journalists critical of its policies has intensified in recent weeks, particularly following the fatal shootings of two U.S. citizens by federal immigration agents in Minnesota. The Justice Department's pursuit of charges against Lehman, despite initial judicial rejection, raises questions about prosecutorial discretion and the application of civil rights laws to journalistic activity. Legal experts note the unusual nature of charging a journalist under the FACE Act for covering a protest, particularly when video evidence shows the journalist conducting interviews rather than participating in disruptive activities. The case also highlights the complex legal terrain surrounding protest coverage. While journalists have First Amendment protections, those protections have limits when criminal activity occurs. The central legal question appears to be whether Lemon's presence and reporting constituted protected journalistic activity, or whether prosecutors can demonstrate he crossed the line into participation. The timing of the arrest, coming nearly 2 weeks after the protest, and after initial judicial rejection of charges, has fueled speculation about political motivation. Critics point to the White House's celebratory social media post and the Attorney General's personal involvement as evidence the prosecution is driven by animus toward a prominent Trump critic, rather than legitimate law enforcement concerns. Supporters of the prosecution argue that the disruption of religious services is a serious matter protected by federal law, and that journalistic status does not provide immunity from prosecution for criminal conduct. They note that other participants in the protest have been arrested and charged, and that Lehman should not receive special treatment because of his prominence. The case will test the boundaries of press freedom under the Trump administration and may have significant implications for journalists covering protests and civil unrest. The outcome could establish precedent for when journalists can be held criminally liable for their presence at events where others engage in illegal activity. Lemon's legal team is expected to mount a vigorous defense based on First Amendment protections for journalists. The video evidence showing Lemon conducting interviews and explicitly stating he was there as a journalist rather than an activist will likely form the cornerstone of that defense. The case also intersects with broader tensions over immigration enforcement in Minnesota. The fatal shootings of Renee Good and Alex Pretty by federal agents have sparked protests and calls for accountability. The decision to prosecute journalists and protesters who demonstrated against ICE while the shootings remain under investigation, has been characterized by critics as a prioritization of protecting federal agents over holding them accountable. The arrests come at a moment of heightened scrutiny of the Trump administration's immigration policies and enforcement tactics. The decision to target a prominent journalist for prosecution has amplified criticism and intensified debate over whether the administration is using law enforcement tools to silence critics. As the case proceeds through the courts, it will be closely watched by journalists, press freedom advocates, legal experts, and civil liberties organizations. The resolution may have lasting implications for the relationship between the press and government, particularly during periods of political tension and social unrest.